Hello and good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining from. We wanted to say welcome to this awesome, amazing live stream hosted by Uno AI. I will be one of your hosts slash co-hosts today. My name is Ron Eddings, CEO and co-founder of Hacker Valley Media. With us today, I have the Uno AI team. So let me go ahead and bring them in now. We have Shashank and also Andy. Let's kick off the stream.
Hey Ron, how you doing?
Doing great.
Yeah, I just want to thank you and the team for organizing this wonderful session. And hello and thanks to the audience. Thanks for joining in today. I do want to apologize for the technical glitch that we faced a few minutes back, but we'll make up for it. We'll catch up when we'll try and share some of the learnings that hopefully you walk out feeling it was worth the wait. So thank you for your patience and looking forward to this.
Yes, thank you so much. And yeah, that was a crazy technical difficulty trying to go live to LinkedIn, but we are live on YouTube. Andy, I also wanted to give you a quick moment to introduce yourself and set the stage. What are we going to be speaking about today?
Yeah, so we're going to talk overall about kind of the pathway towards autonomous cyber agents, right? When are we going to get kind of to fully autopilot, and share a little bit of the story of Uno and what it's been like building a co-pilot, some of the lessons that have been learned there along the way. So yeah, it should be fun.
Perfect. Yes, let's have some fun. When I first learned about the Uno AI company and when I met Shashank, I was blown away because one, we live in a world that AI is at the forefront of everyone's mind, especially when you think about things like generative AI and large language models that fall underneath of generative AI. And I think that this is really something that is absolutely needed in the world of cybersecurity. So in the context of Uno AI, you have been building this company since before ChatGPT, Shashank, and your other co-founder as well. Why did you start this? Why was this needed even back then and especially now?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question, and we do have a fun origin story, right? I think we all like to believe that people come up with fancy ideas sitting in their basements and try to change the world. We didn't have any of those sort of moments. What we did have is post pandemic we were talking to leaders in the world of cybersecurity, in fact across the spectrum, those who are practitioners deep into the details, the CISOs, the CIOs, and every other stakeholder. And what we were trying to really get our head around is, you have a very crowded market today. You have over 5,000 companies. There are a lot of different, players who are trying to solve the problems that we face today in the world of cyber. And there still seems to be a massive gap, right? We are nonstop playing catch up. So fast forward, we spend a lot of time just discovery. We ask them questions like, hey, where's the problem? What is it that you'd like to solve? And how would you go about doing that? And funny enough, I think we started seeing some trends which really led towards sort of a couple of themes. One theme was around the fact that actually there is a lot of noise. The too many tools have created more noise than clarity, and there isn't enough skill really to go around. We suffer from tons of complex, tedious, mundane work that sucks the energy out of us, leaving very little for us to really do strategic work and do value added work, which is hopefully where we should be focused, right? 100% of the time, but it's not happening. So anyway, so that got us thinking, and we sort of stepped back and said, well, what should we build? How do we respond to this challenge? And the answer seemed very clear that obviously you couldn't train people overnight, and you couldn't suddenly change the whole landscape overnight either. That's not going to happen. And what we really need is supplement this with some smarts, and let that be an intelligent machine. Let that be a machine that can be like a force multiplier that understands stuff and becomes by the side of every cybersecurity professional out there. And so therefore everything that takes us, let's say, a month to do, we could do it in a day or maybe even in an hour. And everything that is hair splitting and driving us crazy in terms of its complexity and bringing everything together becomes more easy, becomes easy to find it the same way that we find other things in life by asking for help and quickly searching things, and quickly sort of trying to piece the various parts of the puzzle together. So that led to the whole notion of, well, we need something like a copilot. Now, remember, as you rightly mentioned, this is pre-chat GPT era, right? So there was no broad talk about generative AI or LLM. I mean, it was being discussed in sort of research circles, and we had hired some of those folks early, but it was still very limited. It wasn't there in common parlance, and so it was a tough concept. We would go and tell people back, I think I want to build you a smart machine that will do a lot of work for you. And people would look at us with two mixed feelings: amazement on one side and disbelief on the others, right? So I was like, okay, that sounds very cool. I would love it. But how are you going to do it? Like, is that another just fluff story that you're kind of trying to sell it to me? So it was an interesting exercise when we got started. But, very, very glad that uh, we did. And, it took us down a path. So like that's the kind of backstory here. um, Certainly it hasn't been all, I would say, straight line, right? It's not like we knew all the different pieces of the puzzle and started solving them nicely and beautifully, and it all came through. It's been an exercise in discovery, right? It's been an exercise in also trying to understand what this newer generational stuff can do for us and how far can it take us. So
Love that.
it's been the sort of backstory here.
That's amazing. And there's so many problems to solve in cybersecurity. We have some visual representation that we're going to be showing off in just a second. And what we could look at is the fact that cybersecurity is moving at such a fast pace. So let's go ahead and pull up that visual and kind of talk through exactly why this is so needed. Like I was just mentioning, cybersecurity is moving faster than ever. The attackers are moving faster than ever, but also so is the adoption of technology. Not only is there the threat of adversaries breaching your organization, but there's also just the threat of leaking out that sensitive customer information.
100%. I think you kind of said it. There are essentially two themes, in my opinion, that have become front and center in cybersecurity. One is just the speed of change, and as you mentioned, speed of change on all dimensions, right? More types of attacks, more frequency of attacks, uh, more adversaries perhaps coming up on the scene, seeing the opportunity, attacks themselves becoming a lot more serious than they ever were, right? Like now you have nation state centric attacks. These are not just hackers trying to go and pocket some money. um, and so all kinds of attacks are increasing, right? And everybody's under attack. It's not even like, hey, you are a Fortune 500 company with a ton of digital assets, so you are the one who would be hacked or attacked. It's even a school or a charity hospital, or a city municipal corporation. They're all being attacked, right? And so I think like that's one thing that certainly is waking up the masses, but also creating newer challenges, right? So that's one side of the story. And then the other one, of course, is the fact that there is certainly a lot more conversation about it, which one could argue is because of all the attacks, but certainly everybody's talking about it, right? And there is a lot more adoption of technology. There's a lot more appetite now for technology to play a bigger role, right? In the past, one was still skeptical about what a technology could do, right? We were still debating that. I think we are way beyond that debate. Now I think the topic has really moved towards, well, which technology can really help us and how far can it go? What value can it add? Is it easy for me to adopt? Will it give me value today, or do I have to struggle with it for the next multiple months and years before I get value, right? So like I think that in a way again is good, but also challenging, because there's a lot of good um, development in the world of artificial intelligence, as an example, and also in terms of just broader technology that supports it and makes it possible today. But not everybody understands it at the same level, right? So there's a lot of sort of gap in understanding, gap in seeing how far can we go with this. Is this something that will save the day, or is this another big buzzword that's going to keep us all busy for a little bit before it gets replaced by the next one, right? So like that's for real, and security practitioners especially struggle with it, and I don't think that goes away in this case. I do feel though that I think this time there is a big difference. The technology has certainly matured, and there is an inflection point. It's come to a stage where it can really deliver value, and that's what we've learned also, right, from our own experience. That there are some newer tools, if you may, or newer techniques and newer trades that can now be combined gainfully to do things that we could not do at scale, right, in the past. So there's certainly like humongous amounts of promise, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think Shank, we talked about this a little bit. I think we're, obviously the space is moving quickly, but in some ways we're still, quite early days. I think in for cyber overall, but and certainly for kind of the role that AI is going to play, right? And I think in in this discussion, right, I think it's often useful to kind of use other industries, the sort of history that's been there. Obviously, in this one, we are sort of comparing things a lot to sort of what happened in the auto industry and the transformation there. And you think about just the pace and the length of time that we've been thinking about cars, right? I mean, really going back to kind of early 20th century. We're 100 years plus on from kind of the explosion that we saw with the sort of adding of the of machine and industrial processes really to the construction of cars. Right, Henry Ford added the added those processes, and you just saw this just explosion in the creation of cars, right? The assembly line and what that did. And so I think we're kind of at a watershed moment for us, right? I think AI may be kind of like that assembly line for cyber. And I think in some ways, I think it's hard for people to imagine kind of how big the change is going to be and how quickly it's going to happen, right? I think um, I was looking, I'm a history guy. So, in 1913, they invented the Henry Ford out of the assembly line. They were making about 50,000 cars a year. Within 3 years, Ford was making 600,000 cars, right? Like
Mm.
a 10x, more than 10x increase. And I think we're sort of maybe, you know, in the same sort of moment, and certainly kind of early things that we're seeing is that level of like 10x improvement, 10x increase, maybe even more. So
Yeah, yeah. No, that is actually a very interesting analogy, and I sort of like that. And I like that because of, I think there are two, 3 points that you already highlighted, Andy, but also I think even beyond that, where I think understanding it gives us like a mental model to understand where AI can take us. If you look at car technology, also, you could almost divide them into eras or epochs, right? You could say, hey, there was the original one that made it happen, right? Like that is the very first generation. And, then you get into a more automation of the car itself, where we weren't rolling up windows by hand, but, now the kind of the power was doing it for us, right? It became a little button click. And then that got replaced with the fact that in many of those things that we do with the cars, we didn't even have to click a button, they were just happening, right? For example, the classic one for anybody who's ever driven a stick shift, and I know a modern generation may have not even heard of that concept. There was a whole skill, if you may, when you learn to drive a car, to change the gear at the right moment in the right way, right? And in today's modern cars, it's a skill that is completely unnecessary because you can't even exert or exercise that skill unless you went and bought a specialty car that had still had that feature, right? And that has really led to the adoption. And then beyond that, today we are of course talking about autonomous driving, where the car itself is driving itself. So yeah, if you start thinking like that in sections, we've almost gone through eras. I do feel that the AI adoption in a way, and the modern generation AI and what it can do for us is also sort of going through those various transitioning from one epoch or transitioning from one era to the other. And as you sort of use that word watershed moment, right, which was experienced by Henry Ford over whatever roughly 100 years ago, where they were building things by hand and doing small volumes, and suddenly now the assembly line revolutionized that. Now you could do that hundreds of thousands of them, and today of course that's the reality, right? Like most car manufacturers churn out millions of vehicles in a very fast pace, and have a good handle in terms of how they manage quality and quantity. And there is a little bit of lesson there, right? Because if you bring that same story back to the world of cybersecurity, there are still a lot of processes, right, across governance and risk, and areas like security operations and vulnerability management and threat hunting and what have you, right? Like the entire gamut of things that keeps us very busy. In every discipline, there is a substantial part of manual work. There is a substantial part of effort that goes simply into collecting information and gathering pieces of the puzzle before you start solving them. And if you start, if somebody did like a work study and said, well, what's the proportion of time that we're spending on those, I have no doubts, and I've probably seen some studies as well around it, although it kind of defeats me at the moment. I don't doesn't pop up. That's correct. I think that's right. That was one of the studies as well that brought out. And in fact, it also did in dollar terms, right? It was saying that, if you look at it, the manual work or, human driven work is upwards of 100 billion plus, maybe upwards of 150 billion plus of effort and growing, right? Like that's the other part of the puzzle. You would assume that a lot of automation will reduce it, but simultaneously the automation is increasing, but so is the manual work, right? And this is not surprising. Like, if you go speak to these practitioners in the field, and that's what also confirmed our own learnings, is we would go and talk to these GRC analysts and security analysts and folks who are triaging through vulnerabilities all day long, and they would totally confirm it. In fact, sometimes we would be horrified when we learned what they did on a day to day or a week on week basis, because honestly they were just spending lots of times reading through reams of stuff and just putting stuff in Excel sheets and going through it. But that's what the job demanded. How else are they going to be on top of it, right? And this was after automation. It's not like there's no automation that exists. I mean, there are a ton of tools that get them all these inputs and it gets them started, but there's still a humongous part of the human puzzle, right? That remains. So then the question, I think, is that, from again going back to the watershed moment analogy, is like, can this generation of AI really take up some of those tasks? Can it really make a difference, right? Like that's the key question. And that's a quest that we went after. And I think, like, if you start parsing that, you start looking at it more in terms of traits, right? And you start thinking, hey, what are the behavior pieces that humans are doing that potentially an AI can do, right? And so that's when you start thinking, well, they're reading the material, they're trying to make sense of the material, they are trying to correlate things, they're trying to find meaning out of it, they're trying to make decisions out of the meaning that they have extracted, right? Like these are things that humans are doing. And so, at a very fundamental 101 level, the question really translates to then, hey, can a machine do it? Are we at that stage where AI can really start doing some of those things? Can it read like a human? Can it be smart in terms of getting the nuances, right? Not just kind of blind reading it, but getting the context behind it. So, for example, like if you're reading a regulatory document, right, just as a classic example, a GRC analyst or a lawyer or a compliance professional reads it with a certain lens, a certain eye, right, where they're able to then correlate it back to their discipline, where the words mean some things and they get interpreted in a certain way. And the question is, can AI do that? Like, can AI basically do that same thing of reading that, let's just say a SOC 2 type 2 or the new EU AI regulation document, or HIPAA, or one of these new guidelines from SEC, and basically parse through it and understand it same as an expert, right? And then tell us what to do, right? Can it even figure out, and maybe even not even tell us, but actually do it, right? And then leave it for us finally just to review and have a closure on it, right? And so that's the quest we went down, and I think that going down that path has been extremely rewarding, because we've learned a ton also in the process. Not everything is doable, a lot of things are doable. The power fluency of the language model is just outstanding, right? There is something to understanding the language. Then when I say understanding the language, it's not just about quite literally reading it and spitting it out, but understanding the nuances and grammar and structure and context, and the sort of, even when you talk about documents, even understanding how they are presented, why they exist in a certain way, right? Like and you would think that, I'll give you an example, not to ramble up here, but something that's sort of interesting to take an analogy from. When we read a particular page, right? Let's say we have 4 pages of documents. Our eye moves in a way and parses things in a certain way. We read something which is a title, or we read something that is a list of items or a paragraph in a certain way. And when we do that, we also extract meaning out of it in a certain way, right? The heading or the title tells us something. It almost sets the stage for us, isn't it? Like we look at it and say, oh, this is the content out there, right? And so then when we go and start reading the content, we read with that title in mind, effectively. If there is a list of items, we process that in a certain way, because as humans, the moment we start enumerating something or going through a list, our brain sort of starts processing either that list as a set of action items, or a set of tenets to follow, or a set of things that I should think about, or a list of attributes, right? Like that's how our brain starts orienting. And so then when we have read through, let's say, 2 or 3 pages of it, where we've understood, oh yeah, this was the title, this is the highlight, this is the theme, here were the action items, this is the real content, and within the content, here is some numerical data, and this is some qualitative data that goes with it, and this is the context of it, and this is what we're talking about. That is what enables us to then go make those wise decisions, right? So that's when we go, after reading these documents, say, well, you know what, this is a requirement, I need so and so controls, right? Or these are the kind of actions I need to take, to really sort of have my appropriate governance risk model or cybersecurity posture, or sort of analysis that I need to do. And the question is, can the machine do that, right? And I think the good news is we have learned from our all the experimentation that it's possible. I wouldn't say it's perfect, there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's very possible, right? And that's the good news, that's the watershed moment, that's the big things that we couldn't do before that is getting unlocked right now. So like that's what at least gets me all super thrilled, and I feel like I think we got to peel the onion few more layers there, right? Like do more there.
um, about cyber in particularly is the novelty, right? Like I've often described cyber as kind of the land of broken toys, and you don't necessarily know what's coming next, right? And so sort of classic automation does very well if you sort of have discrete set of inputs and your outputs, and you can now, okay, let's automate a process that is largely known. um, you know that's not the world of a lot of cyber, right? Like what's there's so much new stuff, new vulnerabilities, et cetera, new regulations. And so that sort of ability to add, and for AI to handle novelty, right? And to build kind of those patterns, right? Just the way the human does, hey, this is a title, this is, these are numbers, right? To create, more generalized pattern matching, and also to handle a lot of data that is unstructured, right? I'd love, Shashank, if you maybe speak to kind of some of the power of the new models for handling unstructured data in particular.
It's an excellent point, right? I mean, this is something that something to kind of really think about, I would say, in in a sort of multi-dimensional manner. So the way I would rephrase this, rather, right? I mean, you make some excellent points there, a bunch of different points, but I would rephrase this is in saying that there are effectively three different ways of thinking about this possibility, right? And I'm just kind of define the possibility set. So on one side is the unknown, as you sort of called out, right? Like the first one would be, I haven't seen a situation, or I don't know of a pathway, right? The new thing, can I make sense out of the new thing, right? So that's like a big question, right? Even before we start answering it. The second part is the unstructured data set. Like, even the inputs that I have or what is available to me is not nicely structured, labeled, sitting in tables, sitting sort of pre-parsed for me or anything like that, right? Like what I being dealt with is this data that is sort of spread across different types of sources. Some are sitting in PDF documents, some are sitting in Word documents, some manifest as rows in a spreadsheet, some are nice structured database tables, some are actually dashboards and charts, and so on and so forth, right? Like the way that it manifests is endless, right? It's very unstructured, and in some cases it's also very localized, in the sense that it could be notes of a human being, right? That may even lack the full context. You don't know what that really means. In other words, that could manifest as a comment in a incident response ticket, for example, right? And as a human being, sometimes we can read and understand it, right? And I'll get to it in a short bit, but there is the whole sort of unstructured part. And then the third part of the puzzle, which is very important, is also what I would really call the problem of autonomy or agency. And and that takes us also down the conversation of an autopilot, perhaps. But so there are three big questions, right, to be answered. Can I deal with situations I've never seen before? How do I deal with unstructured data, right, that I may lack context in, right, or may not fully understand? And the third thing is, as a machine, right, can I have the autonomy, the independence, the ability to make decisions, right? Which is basically is at the heart of what we today are, like to call autonomous systems. I'll maybe start with the third one first, with the autonomous systems. And I feel a bit, bit confused also about it, because what has ended up happening is that a lot of people have loosely defined autonomous systems and taken them in like all kinds of directions, which is causing a ton of confusion, unfortunately. Right? Like, for example, recently there was a research that came out which is being shared quite a bit about, hey, can a large language model autonomously hack a website? Right? And a lot of people shared that and got very thrilled about that content. But if you parse that content a little deeper and look at it from a technology standpoint, there is absolutely zero evidence of autonomy in that research. What it does show is that, yes, given a set of rule sets, the website can do what you would do otherwise by scripting. Basically, you are not scripting it, it's kind of scripting it for you. But scripting it for you falls, in my opinion, closer to the automation that we have seen so far. And sure enough, it's productive. And by no means I want to belittle that in any way, but it is not the same as agency or decision making. The agency or decision making happens with an adversary. For example, if there is a hacker, and this is the classic sort of anybody who studied, sort of hacker behavior, they don't go about in a structured manner, right? It's not like they're saying, hey, I need to first get a certification, then I'll study this course, then I will do a whole thing on IAM and identity, then I will go steal a credential. It doesn't work like that, unfortunately, right? What they're going to do is they'll scramble their way out. They'll go and start looking at the dark web. They'll go figure out things on the internet. Like, hey, how do I do it? Okay, the phishing seems to work. Fine. I'm going to go and try phishing. While they are trying phishing, in parallel, they might go and try some other things, like maybe search for or buy out stolen credentials, right? And this is the human decision making. This is called hacking, where you have the agency and autonomy to figure out and prioritize and say, hey, this one is actually smart. But oh, did I actually look at that? Oh, I don't know this. And maybe there are also other things that we don't know of, like maybe they tap a friend of theirs and ask for advice, who has probably hacked something successfully before. um, so
So,
anyway, the
so,
question is,
so
can
can you
we build that autonomy out there in the system? Yes, go ahead. I think it looks like you
Yeah,
had
so
some sort of.
just help. I think that's a really interesting point, but maybe just help me understand it. So you see sort of decision making as when you face a number of options or sort of changing conditions and then have to react to it, as opposed to kind of like, okay, we run a discrete, we can sort of do things without, help from a human or expertise, but there's not really decision making. Am I getting
That's
that?
100% correct. That's 100% correct, right? And I will try and simplify it down, because there's a whole field out there of autonomous cyber defense agents, and how they should be modeled. And in fact, we are working on an interesting research around it, which is our next sort of leg towards autopilot. But if you simplify it down, it boils down to two things. One is, can I basically decide about things that I've never seen before, right? Like, I have no idea what that situation looks like, so it's not programmed in my head yet. And when I come across it, will I be able to make sense of it and decide, right? And then the second part of that puzzle is, as in sort of AI and ML world, the normal terminology used there is a reward function, right, which is very popular in reinforcement loops. Very simply, kind of to explain that, the idea is like, given a bunch of choices, which one would the machine take, right? And then whichever choice it takes, let's say there are three choices and picks up the choice one, what would incentivize it to keep moving down that path, as opposed to saying, oh, okay, you know what, this is a dead end, I got to move somewhere else, right? So that kind of gets decided by sort of like a reward function, if you may, which in other words simply is like, it's reinforcing the quest that you are after, right? Very simply put in sort of common language. Now the question is, what happens if you don't know those? Can you dynamically go and figure it out, right? And if you look at human behavior, that's what we do all day long, right? We don't think of it that way because we just take it for granted, but that's what we do. We meet a new individual on the street. How do we make a determination if that person is friendly, or like, hey, I need to keep away with this person? How should I approach the conversation? What questions should I ask? I'm just like taking an arbitrary example, but something that all of us can associate with, because we all meet strangers all day long, right? And then the funny thing is, if you really think about your own experiences, there are many strangers that we hit off with, boom, like immediately we are able to connect with them. There's a chemistry, as we like to call it, right? With some we don't, for whatever reason, right? And then some conversations end up becoming very positive and fantastic. We come out energized, and some become sort of go down a path that we would prefer not for it to go down, right? And so all of this dynamic behavior and the dynamic sort of interaction gets discovered as we do, right? Like we've never met that person. It's one thing that, hey, if I know you, for example, Andy, and I can say, yeah, Andy might like this or not like this, or Ron, Ron prefers this, right? So that's a very different story than a complete stranger who I've never met, because I don't know what they like. I don't know what the preferences are, but I'm kind of discovering it, right? I'm making decisions and discovery all at the same time, right? I'm talking to them, and basis what they're saying, the brain is also able to kind of correlate. So, oh, maybe he's this kind of a person, or maybe, that's what they think, right? And that's very dynamic. My reward function in my head is kind of moving from one side to the other, quite literally, right? And so this is where you're part of, can I recognize patterns? It's not so much patterns into the known patterns, but somehow able to decipher expectations and patterns out of things that I have not seen. And I think that that's where the autonomy part comes in. That's where the autopilot part comes in. And I think we're a little distance away from it, very realistically speaking. There are a few things that is heading us and taking in that direction. And there's enough amounts of, I would say, foundational pieces that is coming together, right? Just like going back to your car analogy, right? Like the lane assist is there, the full driving is not there. Let's put it that way, right? So
Yeah, and I guess what maybe we could talk a little bit about kind of the LLMs, right? Because I think that's what perhaps surprised so many people in the last couple of years of how well they are able to create newness, right? Like they can create new poems and new scripts and whatnot, right? But that maybe that newness or that ability to handle novelty on in some domains maybe isn't. How do you think about that kind of specifically in the cyber domain or some of these other places where it's more more helpful for daily business of what cyber folks do?
yeah, yeah. um, that's true. Well, firstly, I must acknowledge that LLMs, Gen AI has certainly become incredibly popular. Everyone's talking about it, which is definitely good overall for society, because people are exploring, right, the power of new tools, new technologies. But also, I think the fact is that maybe we are misunderstanding it as well, or at least the current generation of LLMs, we are maybe going a little two steps beyond what it does, right? So for example, I think the point that you make right here is like, hey, LLMs are able to discover things. They're creative, essentially, right? In the definitional sense, they're able to come up with things. You ask them to write a poem, they can do that. You can summarize things. um, there is a whole bunch of things that they can do, right? Which is beautiful, which is great. But if you sort of step back a little bit out there in that universe and look at it more from first principles again and say, hey, what is this LLM really doing for me, right? So what it's really doing is, basis whatever it has been trained on, right? And in this case, of course, we can get into the details, but there is the data in the web, essentially, right? Very, very sort of succinctly put, that has trained it, right? So it has built up a corpus, if you may, or a knowledge base of some form. It is able to predict the next piece, right? So make up things, right? It is able to say things with confidence that it feels it has known basis what it has learned. However, one has to realize that it's at a very basic level a kind of a statistical machine. It's helping you predict the next thing depending on the input. It does not have an understanding of context or cognition. In the sense, it might sound very odd, but it does not know what it's saying, right? There is no consciousness out there or no understanding what it's saying. And that is why sometimes we talk about this in the industry quite a bit lately, the hallucination problem. It's like, hey, it's saying, making things up. For example, this was a very common thing that was talked about in the world of cyber as well. When ChatGPT came around, everybody got super thrilled. Said, hey, let's ask ChatGPT what's the most severe vulnerability and how to solve it. And so I do know this was being quoted out there. Somebody said, well, what's the biggest vulnerability? And this came in 2022, right? November 2022 is when ChatGPT came around, and December onwards, people started doing, it's like, hey, what's the most critical vulnerability and how do I solve it? And ChatGPT came back and gave a very beautiful, well-written note saying, yeah, this is CVE number, blah, blah, blah. It actually deals with the Apache thing server. This is the main crux of the problem. You should go patch it. I think there is whatever SLA is going. So it sounded extremely earnest. It sounded extremely smart. But you know what? Where the fallacy was, that damn CV didn't exist. It was made up. It was fake, right? So the question was, yeah. so, so that's where I think like people got confused. Like, oh, but this sounded so real. right? Like I almost believed it, and I would have even maybe sent a message internally and tie my company wide to say, hey, guys, we need to double down on the CVE. I'm glad that I went and checked back from the database to realize that it doesn't even exist, and that's a kind of hallucination problem. But if you think about it, it's kind of a feature, right? Like that's what it does. Given whatever it knows, it makes up things, right? Which sort of sound correct. It's not cognizant. It doesn't understand what a CVE really is, and it's not going looking up from a source of information in real time, right? It's not doing that. And so people have now started, developers, in fact, and a lot of technologists are saying, well, let's supplement that with some real time data or enterprise data, right? And so now you start having a lot of conversations about how do we bring these different things together. Can I pull in from a relational database? Can I pull in from a graph database? Can I supplement it using text, right? And there's this whole field of retrieval augmented generation, if you may. It solves part of the problem. It definitely does, because now you have checks and balances. It's not picture perfect though, right? Because then the question becomes, how many checks and balances are you going to put? Are you going to put checks and balances during input, checks and balances during output, checks and balances with the options it presents? And then what happens if it continues to give you fake stuff, right? So think of it this way: I asked somebody a question and they gave the answer back, right? And then they gave it quickly, but they have not taken the responsibility of it being to be correct. And how far will you keep going, right? This reminds me of, in fact, a funny joke that I saw. So there's like one guy who asked the other guy, I want to see how fast can you do math, right? And she says, okay, go for it, ask me a question. He said, what's 17 times 47? He said 16. He said, oh, that's not even close. He said, well, you said fast, you didn't say it has to be correct.
Exactly.
So it's like that kind of a problem, right? Like the LLM hasn't taken responsibility for it to be accurate, right? It is not a truth seeking machine. uh, but yes, it will give you a nice response that will sound nice and sound right, right? So there's a bit of that struggle there with LLMs.
Yeah. So how? I mean, like, where do you see it? Where do you see them useful? Like, do you? I mean, do they have a role here
Oh,
in your
100%.
cyber?
100%. Yeah, yeah, they definitely have a role. So I think the way we have to parse that is like, what LLMs good for, right? And I think like the simple answer is LLMs are really fluent with the language, right? They're able to deal with the language. They can construct things, they can generate things, they write sentences, right, which make sense. Like they have a fluency in terms of the construction, the understanding, the building blocks of a language. So then the question becomes, well, there are two things you should do with LLMs. And firstly, LLMs also, I don't think one should go with just one model. I mean, there are multiple models out there, so one should look at combining the best of breed, if you may, use the right tool for the right job. But there are many of these language models or LLMs at large that have immense capability in doing things that required fluency, right? Like think of it this way: it's like, hey, I want to summarize something, I want to describe this. Given this piece of information, can you also generate a checklist for me? Like those kinds of things it is very capable of doing, provided the inputs are good, right? And that's where we talk about prompt tuning and prompt engineering and supplementing with other kinds of data sets. But don't use it as a truth seeking machine, right? Don't use it as your primary reasoning engine. So I think like if you combine that, like you take the power of language models, right? And so therefore now you have the fluency of language, because ultimately we all communicate, right? Like as human beings, we communicate. We communicate our questions, we communicate our learnings, we communicate our understanding, we communicate to even disperse information. So like that's where LLM can help us, right? Like it helps us up our communication game by being this fluent, smart friend by our side at all times effectively, right? And then you can use it in multiple ways to sharpen that chisel. The other side is of course truth seeking, and that's where you get into your root cause analysis and understanding the real problem, finding how they're correlated. And parts of those puzzle are better served using other AI techniques, right? Where you can also go around, neural nets are good at doing some of those pieces, right? Like we use a whole bunch within our setup with graph neural networks, right? And we extensively use this concept of a knowledge graph time machine. And then there are places where it's like 1 + 1 = 3, in the sense that you take the power of that neural network, right, on one side, and the sort of external data sets and reasoning, and do a lot of those pieces of the puzzle, bring that with the language fluency, combine them both, and now it appears like an analyst, right? Like now you start doing things that a human being can do. Still not picture perfect, there's still a bunch of things to be done there, but it starts getting in the right direction, right? And that's where the real value of Copilot is. um, which also I think one thing to surmise and think about. I mean, I don't necessarily have all the answers, but certainly have a again a mental model to think through. Is there are certain types of use cases where certainly it's going to outshine, right? Come through very nicely. For example, again, that's something that involves lots of reading or understanding or explaining, or and in some cases it may not be the best tool, right? There might be alternatives that might actually perform better, right? So I think like that's another piece to think about in terms of cybersecurity use cases. Which parts of the mundane tedious work can we use this newer generation AI and take advantage? Let's force multiply, right? Go faster and go further from there.
Anyone that hears the term cybersecurity copilot, or even better yet, cybersecurity autopilot, there's got to be skepticism. When we first met, Shashank, you mentioned that I asked what was the most surprising thing when speaking with prospects and customers, and you said the skepticism that they have when doing something like a proof of value, proof of concept, or a demo. Like they think because they've been burnt so many times by this term AI that it's not gonna pan out. So how do you battle this not being yet another hype cycle? Because I do believe that the technology and the capability and the trade craft is there to have at least a co-pilot today.
Yeah, no, 100%. um, I think you've hit the nail on the head, right? Like there are two sentiments that we faced all the time around, and this was both, I think, energizing in a way because it's like almost bouncing against the wall and then feeling like, hey, I got to come back better next time. And it was also in some moments, I would say, a reality one had to deal with. And I would parse both the sentiments and sort of give my 2 cents here. One is the skepticism, right? Like this, and the skepticism is very ingrained and deeply sort of rooted in the cybersecurity community. And I'll share some points, and I totally empathize with those people why they are skeptic, and you know um, why they have that reservation. And the second part is kind of like the twin of that, if you may, or the other side of the coin is proof of value. Sometimes seeing is believing. It's like, okay, what
Mhm.
kind of proof value can you show that can flip the people on the other side, right? um, and then there is like there is a little saying, if you may, that I want to just bring in here, and I'll quickly attend to both. Is like, usually when there is a debate like this, or there is a contentious topic, if you may, it's better for people to have either for or against it. And this is something that I had read a few years back. I can't remember which one, but I think it kind of stuck with me, because both the for and against have opinions, which means that they're thinking about it, right? And so the for obviously are your champions. Maybe the ones who are anti that and doubting you the most might also become your champions because they are thinking, right? So you can get them, you can activate those neurons and talk to them and maybe convince them. Not everybody's going to get convinced, but some would. However, I think there are a ton of people in cybersecurity who have kind of become passive to this, or they don't care about this, right? They're almost in the middle where it's like, hey, it's another hype cycle. I don't know about it, right? Like this is what I thought XDR was doing, and wasn't UEBA was supposed to be the same? How about SIM and SOAR? That should have solved the problem a decade ago, right? Like so they come with that jaded type of a sentiment, and I totally empathize with them because these are the people who are doing the real work, right? And so they get excited, they bring a new tool, then they realize the amount of effort they have to make to actually operationalize the new tool and take advantage of it is so long, so cumbersome, and the benefit is tiny, right? Or sometimes it is, but in many cases it's like tiny. So then they start questioning. It's like, hey, why did I do all of this, right? I had to retrain all the people, get all these going, more money being spent. Like, what's the deal here, right? Like, I didn't get enough value, right? I won't say everything is fluff, but it kind of starts bordering in that, because everyone's expectation is here, right? Like everyone's thinking this is going to be game changer. You get this tiny small bit. So I think like definitely one has to work with it. So what we learned is we learned two things, sort of. One is that I think always go with seeing is believing. Proof of value is the right way to lead a conversation, and start with the use cases in areas where people can see value easily and value can be shown quickly. So I'll give you one example. If I tell you today, it's like, hey Ron, I'm going to go train something in your place for 3 months, but at the end of the 3 months this thing is going to be so awesome that I'll do everything for you. It will record for you, it will write for you, it will be like your sort of co-pilot that will do everything for you. You can go on vacation, you can start sitting in Hawaii from that day onwards, right? So if I gave you this promise, I think your first thing that is going to be the biggest blocker is like, oh, so I got to wait for 3 months before I even figure out whether this works or not. Forget whether it works or not. The
Mhm.
conversation has now moved from working, not working to timeline, right? And the investment you'll have to make to even get to know and get to that point. And so I feel like that's the challenge that we got to solve with this Copilot, right? So like if you can reduce that down and say, yeah, I can show you this in like 2 days, or how about spending a week, nothing more than that. Let's indulge in this. Here's a specific use case, whatever that is. I can show you value and see if you like it. Is that what you're looking for, right? And use that also as a learning moment and opportunity, because obviously in cyber, we are all learning from each other. And use that as a feedback loop. That's where I think magic will happen, and that's where at least magic is happening for us, right? Like we are seeing a lot of the good feedback and learning, and things where pick up the right battle, pick up the right use cases, show proof of value very quickly, and I think then you will have more people willing to listen to you, at least give you a chance, right? And then you can do the more fun stuff. And I also feel that I think that there is a part of skepticism that also comes out of not only the part that we saw in terms of value, but also especially in terms of AI, a bit of fear, right? Because it's the unknown. So there's also a little bit of, if I bring this unknown black box into my infrastructure, is this going to like become a new headache? Will this actually get compromised, and instead of it helping me, become my new nemesis, right? Like that I'll have to now kind of fight, right? And is this the unpredictable box, if you may, or the unknown, going to go in a direction where I wouldn't want it to go, right? So there's also an equal amount of fear around this new thing, or the new unknown, right? And so I think like the way we go about that is also, and I think everybody should, is like take it head on. Let's address that fears. You may not have answers for everything, but the best way to tackle fear is to talk about it. Let's acknowledge it first, and let's discuss. And yes, there are some things that are unknown, even for people like us who have been deep in it for a couple of years. Certainly we've solved a few problems, but take them on. Let's talk about it, let's solve them, right? Like collaboratively. I think that's where the magic is. That's where the piece is. And then, of course, last sort of my remark there would be, there is certainly a ton of hype. I think in cybersecurity, and it's funny to say that, but there is a trend to it. Maybe that's the human trend that I've picked up. Um, Hype starts building around Jan or Feb, and it peaks around summer every year with these buzzwords, because I think beautifully at the end of spring is RSA, and the new sort of phase starts. It's kind of a funny sort of emotion, but I think we go through this every year in cybersecurity. And interestingly, what happened was ChatGPT was announced November, I think, end November of um, 2022, and that kind of led to that, this beautiful timing, if you may. So I think this was RSA of 2023, when everybody suddenly had a Copilot, right? So that in a way backfired, I think, in the industry as well, because a lot of people like, hey, but you were so and so tool, you've also become a Copilot, and like you were doing something else. Are you also a Copilot? So that created a little bit of skepticism for good reasons, right? And I think like that would even out over a period of time, as the technology would mature and good things would come out of it. So well, that's my sort of 2 cents into the mix.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Shashank. I think the other thing, and I was just reading a book, an interesting book, kind of about the sort of unfulfilled promises of technology, right? And I think one of the things that we expect is a lot of things will kind of advance at Moore's law, right? And the impact that kind of just massive increases in compute power and what that allowed to happen. And actually, most things don't actually advance at that type of speed. Doubling, every 2 years in terms of the capabilities. I actually think, at least we're very early days in AI, but it is following more that type of pattern than many many other things, right? I mean, even if you looked at like car manufacturing, right? Like there was that explosion, and then it's more kind of a linear, right? It's not parabolic improvements, and I think AI we may be there. So I think even if I think it's worth, yeah, I think it is really going to fundamentally change so much stuff, right?
Yeah, 100%. So I think the way I would sort of rephrase a little bit of that is like every innovation or adoption goes through is step functions. It's almost like climbing a ladder, if you may, right? So it climbs to the next step, like kind of plateaus there and climbs the next level and next level. AI, certainly, I think the climbing speed and those steps have been crunched down, right? And that's what's happening every day today. Like every day, every month, you have like much faster iterations than what we may have seen elsewhere, right? And especially with, of course, car manufacturing and others, there are more complexities. You're making real things, right? Like here it's more software, so it also lends itself to faster iterations. But even compared to software, like even if you look at mobile development or cloud or even SaaS or all the good stuff that we've seen, right, that we sit on today, um, or even like technologies like web streaming, right, like what we are doing right now, it has taken us a few decades, right, and there's still glitches like we had one today, right? So that's the reality,
Is
right?
that perfect? Yeah, that's for sure.
Admittedly, we did. So there's, someone out there that's gonna see this. Maybe they're watching this live at this very moment. And you brought up a great point that 2023, everyone started to say, "Hey, I have a little bit of AI. I got AI in my cybersecurity product," but we see it across all of technology. What makes Uno the right, investment for cybersecurity teams, especially with those use cases that you brought up earlier? What makes this solution more advantageous than other solutions?
Good question. And yes, we do get asked this, I guess, every conversation we have with a prospect and customer. So I think very appropriate. The answer is pretty simple in the sense that I think we have really sort of taken this lead by value as our driving light here or driving principle. And so what that has forced us to do, and that's how we kind of operate as a company, forced us to do is double down on enabling use cases and technologies that can add value today with, of course, the research and other interesting stuff that we're doing behind the scenes to sort of continue to innovate, right? So which means today, if you are, let's say, a GRC professional and you want to see substantial 30x jump in speed, we would be a good person to engage with. We're a good company because we've got a solution right for that, as an example, right? That's just one of the examples that I'm putting out there, because the language model fluency plus, all the knowledge graph stuff that we have built out is very appropriate for that kind of a task and really kind of takes away a whole bunch of this, manual tasks that you otherwise do. Similarly, let's say with vulnerability management, and a few other pieces. And so we like to engage with that. We like to encourage our customers to say, well, let's go where you will see maximum value with the least amount of investment, if you may, right? Like a quick value, and let's build off that. Now, in the future, though, I do feel like the advantage we've had because we started a little sooner in the pre-Chat GPT era was that we didn't get colored by Chat GPT, which might sound sort of maybe even contradictory, but I think like I truly believe that that has really helped us because we didn't have those things available. We had to work extra hard to figure out how one should approach this, right? Like sometimes when you don't have all the things in front of you, you have to sort of force yourself to come up with innovative creative ways and build out a more deeper understanding of the problem at hand, right? So that was our reality, right? And so what that has forced us to do is that has just built this whole innovation picture in our DNA, and that is what is now driving us even further and beyond into saying, well, how do we make autonomy real? um, what can we do in terms of the next stage of Copilot itself, right? What kinds of other capabilities can be brought together by using a different sets of models, not just all LLM only, but let's use language models, let's use different types of language models, let's use the deep neural network models where it's relevant. How about using some other techniques out there, like knowledge graphs as an example that I mentioned. And so I think that has kept us a little earnest, right? That has still kept us very much in that mode to go seek the truth, to go innovate every day. And I feel like companies that engage with us, so far I've experienced, tend to like it, right? Because they almost feel like they enjoy the journey that we are on. They also get to influence, learn along the way. So that's my 2 cents there, right? So if you're one of those who likes to see value quickly and want to be on the leading edge and be a partner, I think we are a good team to hang out with, right? So
Love
Fun.
that. All right, so let's go ahead and bring up that last slide. Wanted to, really give you all that last opportunity to instruct the audience. How should they engage? Do you want them to sign up for a demo? I know that there's a wait list. How could they get started with Uno after seeing this webinar?
Yeah, so I would say visit our website, uno.ai, right? You can sign up to join the waitlist for folks. We're happy to give you a demo now, but to actually become a customer, we've got a little bit of a backlog. So want to make sure that it's the right fit for us. We also would love to hear from you guys. Like, what are some of the places where you think AI could be helpful, and you'd be interested in exploring hey, this is the problem set that I have, right? I mean, that's where, we've built all of the sort of applications for our Copilot so far have been out of direct conversations with security leaders and understanding their problems, right? And the third would be, follow us. We've got, a good kind of company newsletter, and I write a newsletter as well, kind of on the future of AI and cyber. And then we'll be having a webinar monthly. So we already have one scheduled for April 3rd, and then there's another one on May 1st. So those next two. The next one will be on kind of the impact of AI, specifically on governance, risk, and compliance, which is an area that we're seeing a lot of interest and excitement. There's a lot of manual tasks there that can be optimized. And then the May one will be on the sort of securing AI and the challenges and opportunities there as well. So sign up for those. You can find those off our LinkedIn page. They'll be on our website as well. And anybody listening to this, we'll follow up with the recording, et cetera. So.
Excellent. Gentlemen, thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much for spending some time with the audience, letting us know all about the path to building a cybersecurity co-pilot. Be sure to drop into the Uno AI page, drop into the LinkedIn, click follow, and be on the lookout for those future webinars. And with that, we will see everyone next time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.